Hello and welcome to Clarkenomics. In this video, we're going to talk about one of the most common ways that we look at the employment situation in the United States, something called the unemployment rate. So, before we get into the rate itself, we're going to look a little bit at how the data is collected that we use to compile the unemployment rate. So, first of all, who is doing all this? Well, there are a couple parties involved here. The first is the Census Bureau, which is a subdivision of the Department of Commerce for the United States of America. And the way that they collect this information is they do a survey every month. They interview over the phone primarily about 60,000 households in the United States. So this is not every household in the United States, but it's a sample that they use to be representative of the country as a whole. So every month they're interviewing about 60,000 households here. They're asking questions, they're recording people's answers, but they're not doing anything else with the information. So the Census Bureau, which, the job everybody knows they have is every 10 years they take the census. Their job every month, not just in a census year, but all the time, is to conduct this survey and get information from people. Once the Census Bureau has completed this task, then it's up to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, better known as the BLS, which is a bureau within the U.S. Department of Labor. So different departments within the U.S. government, these are executive departments, are responsible for gathering and analyzing the information. So, once the Census Bureau hands the information over to the BLS analyzes the answers and determines the following. Are people employed or are they unemployed? Now, to be employed, you have to be 16 or older with work, and that work can be part-time work or it can be full-time work. So if you're over the age of 16 and you're either working part-time or full-time, you're considered employed. Or you're unemployed, which means that you're 16 or older and you don't have work, but the key thing is you've tried to find work within the past 4 weeks. Now, how do they know that? Well, that's one of the questions that you are asked by the Census Bureau. So again, depending on your answer, the Bureau of Labor Statistics will either categorize you as employed or unemployed. And there's other categorizations as well, but we're going to focus on those for now. And all right, now it's time to talk about the labor force. So the labor force is something that's comprised of people that are employed and people that are unemployed. And we've already talked about in the previous slide what kinds of things would make a person employed or unemployed. So to be part of the labor force, that means you're either looking for work or you have work and you're over the age of 16. So who does that leave out? Well, if you really think about it, that's not every single person in the United States is either employed with a job or looking for a job. There's tons of people who are not even part of this labor force, right? So who is not part of it? Well, children under the age of 16 might be one of the obvious answers there. Full-time students who are not looking for work, they're not counted as unemployed, really. Prisoners, people who are institutionalized, people who are retired, right? So they're not looking for work because they are retired. If they were to start looking for work again, well, then they would be part of the labor force again. And finally, something called discouraged workers. Now, discouraged workers are interesting because discouraged workers are people who want to work, but they've given up looking for work. They haven't actively searched for a job in the last 4 weeks. So that's that window there. So when they've searched in the last 4 weeks, they're considered unemployed. But if they give up and haven't looked for 4 weeks, even if they might want a job, we don't count them as unemployed anymore. We count them as a discouraged worker. And they're not part of the labor force if they're a discouraged worker. Now, why does that matter? Well, when we look at the unemployment rate, we're only worrying about people who are in the labor force, and those discouraged workers are not. We'll come back to that in a little bit. So, here is how we calculate the unemployment rate. Now, I don't want to guide you astray here and act like there's just one unemployment rate. There are actually several. So the one that we're going to talk about in this slide is what's called U3. This is kind of like the banner unemployment rate, the one you read about in the news, that's in the headlines. So the calculation for this is pretty simple. You take the number of people who are unemployed and you divide that by the labor force. So, for example, let's imagine in a country this was the situation. We had 50,000 people who are unemployed and 100,000 people who are employed. Can we calculate an unemployment rate based on that information? Well, sure. So this would be our formula. We have our 50,000, that's the number of people unemployed, and we know from the previous slide that the labor force is comprised of people who are employed and unemployed, and so you have to add those unemployed people to the employed people. And if you do this math, that's going to give you 50,000 divided by 150,000, which equals 0.33, which means that the unemployment rate in this situation would be 33%, which is much higher than it actually gets in real life in the United States, but that's just for an example. So here's a diagram that kind of shows you how the United States, adult population breaks down, right? People in the green box are employed. Again, that's either part-time or full-time. People in that red little sliver, those are unemployed people, which means that they don't have a job, but they are looking for one. And in that blue, these are people who are not in the labor force at all. So if you were to look at this information, you should be able to see if you can calculate the unemployment rate based on this diagram. So I'll pause. You can pause the video if you'd like to, because I'm going to give the answer in 3, 2, 1. So this would be the unemployment rate. We have 12.5 million people who are unemployed, divided by 155 million people in the labor force. And if you do that math, that comes out to be 8.06%. And that's an actual unemployment statistic from the United States. So when you look at unemployment, this is a historical graph that goes back to the 1940s, showing you that at some points in U.S. history, the unemployment rate's pretty low, and unfortunately at other points, it's actually pretty high. The highest on this graph is just about here, right? In the early 1980s, the first half of the 1980s, it gets almost up to 11%, and we almost match that in about 2009, right, with the Great Recession. Now in this map, you can see this, I pulled this in April 2020, that since that peak over here, it's gone down and down and down and down, but as coronavirus has started to affect the labor force and employment situation, you can see it's starting to spike back up again, and we'll see where that goes. Nowhere good, I'm guessing. So what I did was I cut out a little sliver from that graph from the previous slide. This is again since January of 2008, 2009. Over the last decade or so, the unemployment rate, although it's gone up a little bit from time to time, has primarily trended down. In fact, right before coronavirus hit the United States, the unemployment rate was at its lowest level in 50 years. So below 4%, about 3.5%. So we're going to see a pretty dramatic swing back up, unfortunately. So what we're going to look at now is the effect of discouraged workers. So I've given you here the information from a previous slide, and we're going to ask what happened to the unemployment rate if 10,000 unemployed people just gave up looking for work. That 4-week period passes and they're like, you know what, I can't find a job, I quit. Well, let's think about what would happen here. The unemployment rate would actually go down if people give up looking for work. Well, how is that possible? Remember that when we calculated this unemployment rate originally, it was 50,000 divided by 150,000. If we were to remove 10,000 people from the unemployed category, and of course 10,000 people from the labor force, the math would look like this. It would now be 40,000 divided by 140,000, which would give you an unemployment rate of 28.57. Now, I bring this up because this can be pretty misleading, right? The unemployment rate went down from 33% to about 29%. And we'd see that data and we'd think to ourselves, yay, that's excellent. The economy is getting better. But did things actually get better or worse? Well, they actually got worse because it's not like, people started hiring more. It's just that some people who were categorized as unemployed just gave up, which is not good. So you have to be really careful when you look at statistics like the unemployment rate, because there's a good amount of stuff that it tells you, but there's a lot more that the unemployment rate doesn't tell you. And fortunately, the people at the BLS know all of this, and they've come up with other measures to maybe help us better gauge the employment situation in the United States, like this one. This is another measure of unemployment called U4. U4 is the purple line on this graph. So if you look at the key up here, the green line is the unemployment rate, that's U3. And then this is total unemployed plus discouraged workers. So the purple line takes into account the people who have given up looking for work within, that situation. So as you might have predicted, the purple line is always going to be higher than the green line because this one actually factors in people who gave up looking for a job. So we do measure that as well. Now, one thing, again, to be really careful about concerning the unemployment rate is the unemployment rate is a national statistic, right? It applies to the whole country. And again, it doesn't tell you, if the unemployment rate is like 10%, that doesn't mean 1 in 10 Americans is looking for a job. What that means is, 10% of Americans who are looking for a job and don't have one can't find one. So you have to understand what these statistics are actually telling you. So remember, it's a national rate, right? Unemployment might be higher for or lower for different subgroups of people, for different demographics. So what I did was I compiled a whole bunch of different graphs here, broken down into different demographics. So let's just take a look through these. So based on gender, the unemployment rate for men is the blue line. The unemployment rate for women is the red line. When the recession came in late 2007, 2008, and the first part of 2009, men, their unemployment rate shot up at a much higher rate than that of women. And since then, they've kind of converged here again. So that's breakdown by gender. Race and ethnicity. I compiled this one based on some commonly viewed ethnic groups here. So we've got our blue line, which is the national unemployment rate, right? U3, the one we've been studying. And you can see that for the white group and the Asian group, those lines are typically below the national unemployment rate. So for white or Asian people, their unemployment rate is actually less, usually, than the national rate. However, for Hispanic or Latino, that's the purple line, that is higher than U3. Always. I don't think it ever actually crosses that one. And then for Black or African American, it's all the way up here. And this is really important to think about because, as the unemployment rate, U3, started to go down over the last decade, people were looking at it and saying, oh, the economy's great. Well, it's not great for everyone. While it might have been about 3.5% for the nation overall, for Black and African American people, it was still here over 5%. So you have to think about this when you look at a single statistic like the unemployment rate. Here's another one. Location. Not every part of the country experiences unemployment the same way. For instance, in 2010, the unemployment rates went up for all states, but some states were hit harder than others. California's unemployment rate zipped all the way up to over 12%. Delaware is the red one, so that was Delaware right there. And North Dakota experienced a little bump, but for instance, they didn't really experience the high levels of unemployment that many other states did. So there's that. Additionally, here's the unemployment rate based on categories of age. And again, these are all questions that the Census Bureau asks. They ask for your demographic information, your age, things like that. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they categorize all of this for us and present us with this information. So, if, for instance, you're somebody who is the purple line, 55 and older, your unemployment rate is pretty consistently low. 25 to 54 years old, that's the green line. Who experiences the highest rates of unemployment? Well, that would be 16 to 19-year-old people. Much, much, much higher. So again, look at this. This is probably one of the more surprising ones. In the 2008-2009 recession, for people under the age of 19, or I guess under the age of 20, their unemployment rate was over 25%. That means 1 out of every 4 of these people who were looking for a job were unable to find a job. And education level. This is a pretty important graph right here if you were ever doubting the importance of your education. Well, people with higher education, so if they've gone to college with at least a bachelor's degree, that's the green line. Even in the worst of times, their unemployment line never got really that high above 5%. Same thing if you had a master's degree or some graduate degree. If you only had a high school diploma, no college, and you're over the age of 25, you're the red line right here. Pretty bad. And if you didn't even graduate high school, well, that was a pretty big unemployment rate for people in that category. So again, we have to remember when we look at the unemployment rate that that's just a national statistic and that for some people the situation might be better, for some people it might be worse. And remember, unemployment's not just a number, it tells us about the quality of life that someone's going to have. Do they have income? Can they afford the things that they need to be happy, the things they need to survive? If you want to see even more breakdowns of unemployment, I compiled a whole bunch of different statistics at this link right here. All of these statistics you might have noticed we're using graphs from a thing called FRED. This is a data, analysis tool that is provided to us by the research department at the St. Louis Federal Reserve. So, hope that was informative and thank you for watching.